The movie starts with a group of Filipino rebels attacking a small Spanish group at Baler during the night. They kill all the soldiers except one. The rebels also destroyed the nearby village during this terrible incident. The story then jumps ahead 3 months. We meet a Spanish soldier on a boat who is part of a unit sent to retake Baler for the King of Spain. The soldier, named Carlos, is seen sketching some drawings. He explains that they are going with the next group to recover the accused town. Little does he know, he and his fellow soldiers will be the last defenders of the Spanish Empire in the Philippines. The Spanish soldiers are led by Captain Enrique Morenas, who brings his dog along with him. The second in command, Lieutenant Martin Cerezo, plays a significant leadership role. When they arrive at the village, they are welcomed by Father Carmelo, who advises them to keep quiet and move silently because the Filipinos are also present in the area. They travel through the lake and forest to reach the village. Upon arrival, they notice the villagers staring at them strangely. They soon meet the only survivor from the previous Spanish garrison, a violent and brutal sergeant named Jimeno. His wife died in Spain, and he feels he has nothing left to live for. The village's flag is currently the Filipino flag, so Lieutenant Cerezo asks Sergeant Jimeno to explain why it is not the flag of Spain. The sergeant explains the preference of the townspeople, but the lieutenant takes charge and raises the Spanish flag in the village. They are also greeted by a local Filipino woman named Teresa, who sings for them and tries to tempt them. However, despite being enchanted by her, no one dares to approach her. The soldiers settle in the church in the village. Father Cerezo is always available to assist them, and the captain briefs his soldiers in the temple. He warns them that the local Filipinos are always on watch to repeat the massacre, so they must remain vigilant. The soldiers also face the threat of malaria due to the extreme heat. While the soldiers are taking their positions, Carlos chats with his fellow soldiers, Juan and Jose. Juan feels that there is no point in fighting the Filipinos and lacks the ambition of the other soldiers. One night, Carlos sees Jimeno burning the Filipino flag they had taken down. The next day, while the soldiers are training, the captain talks with the lieutenant. He reveals that his wife is waiting for him in Spain, and he looks forward to seeing her. The captain explains that there are 2 types of soldiers, those who want to earn medals and those who want to go back home alive. He identifies himself as the second type, but the lieutenant disagrees and prefers the first type because he has no family to return to. The captain warns him that it is dangerous to be the first type and leaves him. Later, the lieutenant encounters Carlos in the forest, and they have a conversation. Carlos mentions his skills in art and his desire to leave the army to study at a fine art school. This information leads him to meet with Father Cerezo, who allows him to paint the walls of the church. Carlos is happy with how things are going and becomes friends with the priest. Later that day, Carlos and Sergeant Jimeno come across a woman screaming in the forest. They discover that she is a Filipino village woman named Teresa, who is being mistreated by the soldiers. The lieutenant intervenes to save her, believing that killing a woman is a sign of weakness, although Sergeant Jimeno disagrees. The following day, a wounded soldier arrives at the church with a message. The message reveals that the Americans have declared war on Spain due to suspicions of Spain sinking their battleships in a city called Cavite. The city of Manila is under siege, and the village where they are stationed is also under threat. Juan, who is assisting the wounded man, becomes hopeless upon hearing this news. The captain informs them that they will no longer receive supplies from Manila and will have to rely on themselves. They are cut off from the rest of the country, and their group of 50 soldiers is responsible for protecting Spain. He tells them that the enemy Tagalog can outnumber them, but with strategic movements they can resist and win the war. In the following scenes, the soldiers fortify the church to make it their permanent refuge. On June 30th, the Tagalog attacked their camp, leading to a shootout between the 2 sides. The attack is unexpected and brutal, causing many casualties on both sides. Despite being outnumbered, the Spanish soldiers managed to kill most of the Tagalog attackers. Sergeant Jimeno and the lieutenant are ready to die in the fight, but the captain orders them to stop firing. Jimeno orders the remaining soldiers to fall back, and the firing ceases. The Tagalog men then approach the church to finish off the Spanish soldiers, but the soldiers lock themselves inside for protection. The following day, the devastating aftermath of the war is discovered. Many men have died, and their lifeless bodies are scattered around, attracting crows. The surviving soldiers, including Juan and Carlos, are receiving treatment for their injuries. Juan believes they cannot win and suggests surrendering, but the others do not listen. Shortly after, Jimeno arrives to inform them that the Tagalog have sent an emissary. They rush outside with some men providing cover. The emissary delivers a message from the Filipino commander, stating that they do not want any more bloodshed. Since the Spanish are losing in other areas, they should also give up. However, the lieutenant resists. Before leaving, the emissary announces a truce until the next day so they can bury the fallen soldiers. Inside, the lieutenant informs the captain about the information, and the captain appears fearful of its validity. Throughout the rest of the day, both sides collect the bodies of the deceased soldiers. It is a traumatic and brutal sight, and Juan loses control when he sees the corpses. He becomes overwhelmed with rage and grief, but he eventually manages to break away from his friends and run towards the Tagalog. The Tagalog embraces him for surrendering, unlike the others. This angers Jimeno, who orders Carlos to shoot Juan. Frightened, Carlos deliberately misses him. Father Cerezo delivers a sermon outside the yard, and they finally bury the fallen soldiers. That night, while Cerezo and Carlos are alone, the priest takes out opium to smoke. He invites Carlos to join him, explaining that it can ease despair and hunger. Carlos sits with him, and they spend the night together, getting high and forgetting about their difficult lives. Meanwhile, outside, Teresa, naked, sings a seductive melody to the soldiers, tempting them to give up. The lieutenant arrives to distract his soldiers, as he now despises Teresa for being a challenging presence. In October, we see more sketches that Carlos has drawn, but they are not well done. The soldiers are becoming sick and weak due to malnutrition. The captain is also unwell, and Sergeant Jimeno watches over him carefully. Jimeno even proposes the idea of eating the captain's dog, since they are all starving. However, the lieutenant dismisses the suggestion and does not grant Jimeno's request. Carlos consults with Dr. Vigil, revealing that the food sacks from Manila were contaminated and that all the soldiers will become even more ill. They are suffering from a disease called beriberi, which leaves the patients unable to walk, eat, talk, or function in any way. Later that day, the Tagalog once again declared that Spain had lost the war and that the Spanish soldiers should surrender. The captain secretly calls Carlos and asks him to go to Manila to verify the news, but Manila is under siege and not safe to reach. The captain promises to write Carlos a letter of commendation for his service if he completes the mission, and Carlos agrees. We observe the captain becoming weaker and sweatier than ever before. While smoking opium and getting high that night, Carlos asks Cerezo for advice on whether he should go to Manila. Cerezo tells him to not fear the future and to rely on God. That same night, the lieutenant catches the captain searching for his dog. The captain is even weaker than before, with swollen legs indicating beriberi. He suddenly falls unconscious and vomits blood, prompting the lieutenant to call for vigil. Sadly, the captain passes away, and the lieutenant takes command from that point. After the burial, Carlos approaches the lieutenant to ask if he can proceed with going to Manila, but the lieutenant tells him that he is in charge now and cannot afford to lose another man. Later, as the captain's dog wanders around, Jimeno catches her and shoots her dead. The meat is cooked into soup for dinner to feed all the soldiers, and sadly, they end up liking it. In December, the army continued to resist. New Year's is approaching, and Teresa continues to tempt the soldiers. This time, she engages in a sensual moment in public. The men are tempted to go out and pursue Filipino women, but they know they cannot. However, on that day, the lieutenant decides to treat them to plenty of wine. Father Carmelo goes to retrieve the wine from the basement, but we notice that he is getting weaker and sicker. His legs are swollen, and he struggles to carry the bag. Carlos comes to his aid, and Carmelo tells him that the opium is running out, and he must endure the withdrawal symptoms. He advises Carlos to stay strong. Unaware of the situation, Carlos leaves, but Father Carmelo passes away shortly afterward. Carlos grieves over his friend's death, and the group gives the priest a proper burial inside the church. Starting that night, the cold and rain intensified. Everyone is cold and hungry. Carlos attempts to smoke his opium for comfort, but he cannot get any smoke out of the tube. There is no more opium left, and he breaks down in terror. The withdrawal symptoms begin to take a toll on him, making him feel irritable and stressed. Meanwhile, the lieutenant hears Teresa singing her melodies once again. This time, he goes outside and shoots her dead. Despite feeling guilty, he believes she brought it upon herself by challenging them every day. Teresa's death led to a temporary ceasefire with the Tagalogs, but later they attacked the church. Carlos, feeling unwell, heard the commotion, but couldn't fully understand what was happening due to his drowsiness. The enemy's sudden attack caught them off guard, forcing most of the men to seek refuge inside the church, while Carlos struggled with opium withdrawal. That night, Jimeno urged them to fight back, so they sneaked out and attacked the sleeping Tagalogs, triggering a violent clash. Amid the chaos, Carlos, in a state of delirium, ignored Jimeno's orders and suggested burning down Tagalog houses. He even harmed a young Filipino boy until Jose intervened. As the firefight intensified, Carlos, in a daze, set a house on fire, prompting the lieutenant to pull him back to safety. Carlos remained unconscious for a while, haunted by blurry visions of Tagalogs chasing them. The next morning, Carlos woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by his superiors, who suspected his opium addiction. They confined him to the basement for withdrawal, while his colleagues enjoyed themselves upstairs. Unaware of his suffering, Carlos endured extreme anxiety and begged for release, crawling on the floor like a desperate child. After weeks of torment, Carlos emerged from the basement a changed man, greeted warmly by his comrades. Soon, a supposed colonel arrived, claiming Spain had relinquished its colonies. The lieutenant, skeptical, refused to believe it despite evidence in a Spanish newspaper. Meanwhile, Juan, once their enemy, persuaded his fellow soldiers to join him, revealing Spain's abandonment. Despite mounting casualties, the lieutenant and Jimeno persisted in fighting the Tagalogs. Carlos, witnessing the futility possibility of the conflict, volunteered to verify the news in Manila. Disguised, he embarked on a perilous journey, but was captured and returned to the Tagalogs' camp. There he learned the truth from the Filipino commander and obtained a horse to return to the Spanish fortress. Arriving at the fortress, Carlos informed the lieutenant of the news, but he remained skeptical. That night, Carlos, Jose, and another friend tried to escape. They sneaked out of the church through the back, but Virgil spotted them. Strangely, he pretended not to see them and allowed their escape. However, as they stepped outside, Jimeno apprehended them, suspecting Carlos of betrayal. Accused of treason, they were locked up in the basement. Jimeno, wielding a Tagalog machete, promptly severed Carlos's arm. The next day, Carlos woke up to his new reality, missing an arm, with no apology from the lieutenant. Sadly, his friends faced a similar fate, destined to be killed in their sleep by Jimeno. Carlos felt despair once more. Despite their losses, the lieutenant refused to surrender, leading to more casualties. As the fortress crumbled, Jimeno was also injured. Although they were clearly losing, the lieutenant remained blind to reality. While some soldiers escorted Sergeant Jimeno inside the church, Carlos had another chance to escape, but he chose to stay with his comrades. Meanwhile, the lieutenant sat at his desk, contemplating a conclusive article. It detailed the transfer of a fellow lieutenant and others due to surrender. Carlos approached him, prompting the lieutenant to confess his belief in the inevitable loss of the colonies. Carlos lamented the pain endured before the lieutenant accepted the truth. Shortly after, preparations were made for the army to surrender to the Tagalogs. On June 2nd, after 11 months of siege, the Spanish soldiers raised the flag of peace outside the church, with Carlos participating proudly. As they left the fortress, Virgil insisted on documenting the deaths truthfully, offering Carlos recognition for his artistry, which he refused, unwilling to be swayed by bribes. As they marched towards the Tagalogs, Juan waved farewell to Carlos. The Tagalogs celebrated their victory, ending the siege of Baler on June 2, 1899, at the cost of many lives. And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our video. Watch the next recaps on the screen and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.